We are live.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another in a series of Socialist Action webcasts. Tonight's topic is new fighter jets, NATO, and the war in Ukraine. My name is Elizabeth Weiss. I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, a past Secretary of Toronto and York Region Labour Council, and a retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people, in a place called Toronto. Today, I'm speaking to you from Jamaica, where the indigenous Taino and Arawak-speaking people began arriving here 4,000 years ago, but were wiped out by European colonial powers. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's featured speakers are Yves Engler of the Canadian Forest Policy Institute, Brent Patterson of the Canada Peace Network, Tamara Lorincz of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, and discussant Barry Weisletter from Socialist Action. Each featured speaker will have up to 11 minutes and the discussant will have up to 5. So let's begin with our first panelist. Yves Engler is 43 years old, is a Vancouver-born, Montreal-based writer and political activist. He heads the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and has confronted more than a few government ministries at their news conferences. Yves has published 11, yes, count them, 11 books, the latest being Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military in October 2021. So welcome back, Yves.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm speaking to everyone from Jojage, otherwise known as Montreal, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations. So what I was going to talk about is focusing on the war in Ukraine and the rise of militarism. So first off, Russia's invasion is a clear violation of international law, very brutal, and it should be unequivocally denounced as horrendous, primarily for Ukrainians. Also, of course, there will be many negative reverberations for Russians, and also, I think, all kinds of negative reverberations around the world, as we're seeing rising military spending in many European countries, in Canada, justified by the invasion. Additionally, it's been a boon to fossil fuel interests, right? Where you have the Trudeau government announcing that the exploration in Labrador, Baie du Nord, oil exploration, and one of the reasons, according to La Presse, that the cabinet agreed to this against the wishes of the environment minister, was this whole claim of energy security in the context of the war in Ukraine. So there's all kinds of negative reverberations that are coming out of this horrible conflict, primarily, again, for Ukrainians. And how I see this conflict, and I think the speakers after me will get to more of the broader context. But basically, what I see has happened here is that the militarists and the imperialists in North America have prodded a policy, have pushed tensions that the militarists and imperialists within Russia have responded in how they respond to these type of things within a horribly devastating warfare. And now the militarists are using a conflict that they helped precipitate to justify expanding military spending, fighter jets, etc. And so understanding how we got to here, or more specifically, how Canada has contributed to how we got here. Canada has been pushing NATO expansion eastward since immediately after Jean Chrétien became prime minister in 1993. Despite, of course, the promises of not an inch eastward that were made to Mikhail Gorbachev at the end of the Cold War, Chrétien immediately began pushing NATO expansion eastward, including to Ukraine. Canada was actually pushed the Americans that they weren't going fast enough with NATO expansion in the mid 1990s. And then when the first round of NATO expansion took place, there wasn't even a debate in Parliament in Canada. It was just an order in council. And that expansionist policy with regards to NATO has continued, most importantly in 2008 at the NATO summit, where the George W. Bush administration pushed for Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. Harper at that time pushed it, as was reported by Canadian press. The French and the Germans opposed that. So did obviously Russia. And I should say, Russians have been opposing this since the 1990s. If you go back and look at the articles in the Canadian media from the mid 1990s around NATO expansion, Chrétien spent time trying to convince Russian officials that NATO expansion eastward was not a threat to Russia. So continued pushing NATO expansion. And then, even in January, Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly reiterated that Canada wanted Ukraine to join NATO. So even in the midst of what was already fairly significant tensions around this issue, with the Russians calling for neutrality for Ukraine, Mélanie Joly doubled down on the pro-NATO expansion. Additionally, Canada's military training mission in Ukraine has been in large part, as Canadian officials have said repeatedly to the press, has been in large part getting the Ukrainian military up to NATO standards, so they're more interoperable with NATO forces. So Ukraine is not part of NATO today, but formally, but you could argue that it's a sort of de facto NATO member state. And Canada has played a central role throughout that process, which the Russians consider a threat or challenge, depending on slight perspective, challenge to their security, and challenge, we should be clear, also to their regional influence. And Russia is a long-standing imperial force. Another part of understanding the ratcheting up of tensions is the Americans putting aggressive weapon systems in Eastern Europe, in Romania, in Poland, and at the same time withdrawing from nuclear treaties, right? In the early 2000s, the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty that the George W. Bush administration pulled out of. And then more recently, the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, a few years ago. And despite the fact it was the Americans that pulled out, the Trudeau government blamed the Russians, right? The Americans were pulling out in large part because they wanted to focus more on China and for their geopolitical reasons. But the Trudeau government blames Russia, even though the evidence suggests it's really the Americans that sabotage that. So of course that is viewed as hostile by Moscow. More importantly, Canada played an important role in the ouster of the elected president in 2014, Viktor Yanukovych. And now some people, they respond to that by saying this was a popular protest, and Canada supported these popular protests. And there's a certain element of truth to that. Of course, they were. Was a popular character to the protests against Yanukovych. But if you look back, as I've written about, immediately when Yanukovych becomes president, the Harper government works to undermine his government. It doesn't begin in late 2013 with the Maidan protests. It begins right away when Yanukovych takes office. And one of the reasons they were trying to undermine him, of course, is because they brought in a resolution saying that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO, right? They passed a law in parliament saying Ukraine wouldn't join NATO to keep neutrality. And of course, right after Yanukovych was overthrown, the pro-NATO parliament that Canada, the U.S. helped bring about, they got rid of that law. And so, to look at Canada's role in the coup of 2014, or if you want to call it the unconstitutional ouster of an elected president, some people get all offended when you use the word coup to describe what happened. Is that Canada funded opposition groups, and that has a long history. You can go back decades. Actually, you can go back, throughout the Cold War, where they were funding nationalistic, anti-Soviet groups within Ukraine. And Chrystia Friedland, that's one of the things she did as a university student in the late 1980s. But the Canadian government has been funding Western-oriented civil society groups in the Ukraine very significantly since at least the Orange Revolution of 2004, where Canada played a very important role in that process, but certainly was building up and funding opposition groups to Yanukovych. On December 5th, early in the Maidan protests, December 5th of 2013, John Baird, Canada's then foreign minister, actually goes to the Maidan protests to the square, and Paul Grod, the head of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, mentions that Canada's foreign minister is at the protests, and then people in the crowd start chanting "Canada, Canada," and you can see in that Netflix documentary that's very pro Maidan protests, you actually see Canadian flags that are flying on protest tents. They have them up on the protest tents. Most importantly, Canada also, they use the Canadian embassy. Protesters use the Canadian embassy for more than a week as a safe haven in the lead up, the days before Yanukovych was ousted, right? Complete violation of international law. The spokesperson of the Canadian embassy was a leading activist, anti-Yanukovych activist. So Canada had its hands in the ouster of the elected president. And then afterwards, all kinds of violence that's unleashed and quietness from Canada. The Odessa massacre on May 2nd of 2014, where 40 plus people were killed at the Trade Union Federation, quietness from Canada. Canada, then when the Ukrainian military collapses because they don't want to kill people in the east of the country as a sort of civil war develops, Canada steps in with Operation Unifier and trains, provides equipment to the military to fight in the conflict in the east that killed 14,000 people before the full-fledged Russian invasion. I'm being told I have to wrap up, but I'm just going to really quickly, one last minute. Poroshenko, the former president, called Jason Kenney the godfather of the modern Ukrainian military in 2019 because of its role in the Operation Unifier and training the military. The other part, a really important part to point out in all of this process. So while we're training the Ukrainian military, we are not doing anything to support the Minsk Accords, right? To end the conflict in the east of the country. The Minsk Accords were basically structured around autonomy for the Donbass region, for the breakaway republics in the east of the country. The Canadian government was supporting the military, blocking the implementation of the Minsk Accords, and publicly not saying anything in support of the Minsk Accords. So just finally, sorry, I'm going too long here, but just, in the recent budget, $500 million was devoted to weapons to the Ukraine. On Tuesday, Justin Trudeau said that we're going to send heavy artillery to the Ukraine. We are ramping up tensions. What was not considered acceptable a week ago is now acceptable. We are in an escalatory process with regards to Ukraine that is incredibly dangerous and scary. And it's essential for internationalist-minded people to do what we can to restrict Canada's role in that escalatory process and to push for negotiations, to push for a negotiated settlement to end this horrible conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. I know it's a big topic to cover in a small amount of time, but hopefully you'll be able to talk more in the discussion period. Our next panelist is Brent Patterson, a political activist, writer, and the executive director of Peace Brigades International Canada. He lives in Ottawa and the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation and participates in Canada Peace Network. Welcome, Brent.
Great. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you. And a real privilege to follow Yves. Let me just take a moment to say I'm rereading this book. I gave my copy to Yves' book. Gave my copy to a friend. So this is a library version, but enjoying it very much and would encourage people to have a look at that book and all of his books. I thought that I would talk about the purchase, the recently announced Canadian government's intention to purchase 88 Lockheed Martin F-35 warplanes. So this was just announced at the end of last month. And what I wanted to talk about was the government has said that it's now entered these sort of final negotiations with Lockheed Martin, the world's largest arms company. It's engaged in these negotiations that could last, could be about 7 months in length before an actual contract is signed. So it means we have, theoretically until about October or so to really look at ways to ramp up popular mobilizations and opposition to this egregious purchase of warplanes. So I have a few ideas on that and a few questions that I think that we, as internationalists, can be thinking about. And maybe just to start by looking at what you might be seeing in mainstream media. So if you're reading mainstream coverage, you might be, first of all, be kind of seeing the price tag. So which is being reported as $19 billion. So that's an incredible amount of money, and we can certainly think about a lot of better ways that can be invested for the public good or spent on meeting the needs of people. But it's also important to say that that's a little bit like kind of like the sticker price on a car and not thinking about insurance or filling it with gas or putting snow tires on it or any kind of repairs or maintenance or anything like that. And so while $19 billion is a huge sum of money, when we look at the life cycle costs of this purchase of these warplanes over the next 30-year period, we're getting closer to an estimated $77 billion. So a massive amount of money being spent, that and sort of a key issue that's being underreported in mainstream media. But that's not really the only issue. Or again, diversion of spending from public good is important, but it's also what's not being reported on is how these warplanes will be used. And so what we're mostly seeing in the news, and maybe picking up just a little bit on what Yves is saying, is right now there's we need these warplanes because of the war in Ukraine. But in a sense, that's very helpful political cover for the Liberal government that had said as an election promise when they were first elected that they would not be buying these airplanes. That was sort of one of those clear promises, like electoral reform and other things. So the war has provided good political cover for the Liberals to move ahead with this purchase. And of course, because it'll be multiple years before the plane is available, it's not like it would be deployed, in the coming days or the coming weeks in this deeply concerning time, as Yves was describing. And it does really fit into this sort of escalatory climate. What we're also seeing in the news is that this is somehow about defending the Arctic, as if, and it's almost as if it's our Arctic or Canada's Arctic, as opposed to stolen Indigenous lands, and what is being framed as defending the Arctic, I think, can also be understood as, in sort of the current political moment, or in terms of geostrategic interests, is that with climate change and the melting ice in the north, increasingly it's opening it up for shipping traffic. It's opening it up to some 90 billion barrels of recoverable oil in the Arctic, and the rare earth minerals that are increasingly being sought after by major economies. So rather than, sort of the sense of we should be defending the Arctic against climate change, we should be thinking about how do we protect the lands and territories and indigenous cultures and traditional uses of land and waters. It's really about defending further resource extraction and exploitation in the north. I think it's also important to look at that in terms of the past 30 years, how the current fleet of CF-18 fighter jets have been used. It's perhaps, again, in mainstream media, it's often made about how they're scrambled because to intercept a bomber or aircraft in the air, as if somehow it's impeding on Canada's territory, as it were. First of all, it's sort of not in territorial airspace; it's in international airspace when it happens. That amount of territory, or that border, that has also been dramatically extended in terms of distance away from this country. And even from military sources, they say it's maybe 7, 8, 10, 12 times a year that this happens, scrambling planes into international airspace. Versus when we look at how the CFA, really the massive way that the CF-18s have been used, it's in bombing missions overseas. It is, we call it a fighter jet, but it's a bomber, it's a warplane. And although mainstream media never really uses the number, just through basic open source research, if you go back to media articles, it's not hard to add up how the airplanes have been used in some 1,600 bombing missions. 1,600 times CF-18s have gone out and bombed countries overseas, as opposed to this 6 or 7 times a year in scrambling in the Arctic. And this is what they're bombing to, just so not to depersonalize it, it's often electrical infrastructure or water infrastructure. And so what we saw particularly in Iraq was the targeting of the electricity grid, which meant that clean drinking water was no longer available, which also resulted in or can be connected to a cholera outbreak that killed some 70,000 people in Iraq. So again, I think when we're looking at these fighter jets, at these warplanes, it's really important to understand, beyond the horrendous cost, really the horrendous ways in which they're used, and how mainstream media spins it as in terms of kind of defending the North, as it were. There's lots of reasons to be concerned about the F-35. Lots of things will be discussed in terms of environmental impacts, about the reliability of the plane itself, the noise, and all of that. all of which is important, and which I think all of us is a responsibility over the next number of months to be really highlighting those issues. I just wanted to highlight a couple questions that I think that we should be raising between now and October, when the contract is to be signed, and certainly after that. One of the first questions we should be asking is, will there be a comprehensive report on the casualties of how the fighter jets have been used over the past 30 years? 1 minute remaining, goodness, that went quickly. So basically, the Department of National Defense does not release casualty figures. So that's something that we should be demanding, that should be released. I'll just quickly go through these questions. We should also be being asked how much money is being allocated for the bombs and missiles that would be attached to these F-35s. It's clearly more than $1 billion, but we should be asking those numbers. We should be asking when a parliamentary budget report will be made available on the real costs, so that we move beyond this $19 billion figure. We should be asking for a greenhouse gas emission count over the next 30 years. How much carbon will these warplanes pump into the atmosphere? I think tomorrow we'll be talking about this, but these planes will be stationed on stolen Indigenous land. We should be pressing that. And then just lastly, as I wrap up, unfortunately, the mainstream political parties have really taken a very weak position on this, and we should be pushing the NDP and the Greens and other parties to be very strong in this and demand that there be a clear parliamentary debate before any contract is signed. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing tomorrow and Barry, and to the questions to come. Thanks.
You're muted.
See, I told you it would happen, and the chair is setting a very good example of it. Okay, our next panelist is Tamara Lorincz, who's a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom Canada. She is currently a PhD candidate in global governance at the Balsillie School for International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University. She is also on the advisory committee of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, World Beyond War, and No to NATO Network. So welcome once again, Tamara.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much to Socialist Action for inviting me. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the fighter jets and NATO, and I'm also going to talk about military spending, and then I'm going to end with some events and campaigns and ways that you can get involved. I'm going to show my slides, so I'll just bring them up right now. Thumbs up. Can everyone see my slides okay? Great. So Brent talked to you a little bit about the procurement of the fighter jets. I'm going to be talking about the stationing of fighter jets in Canada. Canadians, for the most part, don't know about the adverse social and environmental impacts of fighter jets in this country. This is a map from the Department of National Defense, and it shows 36 military installations. These are the military bases and wings in every province and territory. And I'm going to focus on CFB Cold Lake. This is Canada's largest and busiest Air Force base, and it's in Alberta. Is located 3 hours northeast of Edmonton. And Cold Lake is also in a region of the tar sands. It's one of the major oil and gas development areas. So not only is the land around the Cold Lake Air Force Base highly militarized, it's also highly industrialized. And this is traditional Treaty 6 territory. Over the past year, I have been up to Cold Lake twice. So I was just up in Cold Lake and I returned last week. This area is approximately 3 million acres. It's a vast span of territory that crosses from Alberta into Saskatchewan. There's the Cold Lake Air Force Base and the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range. This land was expropriated, effectively stolen from the Treaty 6 First Nations in 1952. The federal government gave very minimal compensation to the First Nations for 8 years, and they stopped making these payments in 1960. The First Nations communities, they complained, they appealed, they protested, they demanded negotiations, they demanded a settlement. It wasn't until 1991 that there was finally a land claims inquiry that was held, and the testimony is heartbreaking. The First Nations people gave, very profound and sad testimony about what the dispossession of the land meant for them. They lost this land and their ability to engage in traditional practices in hunting and gathering, their building of summer camps and winter camps, visiting the ancestral burial grounds. They're dependent on the caribou, and the Air Force Base and the Air Weapons Range contributed to the demise of the caribou in Alberta. And at the end of the inquiry, the recommendation was made that the federal government engage in negotiations and settle the grievance. But it took 14 years later, until 2005, there was a very minimal multi-million-dollar settlement that was made, but it was too little and too late. The trauma that the First Nations communities are around, this is Dene, Cree, and Métis people, have been long lasting. There's problems with poverty and substance abuse, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a moment. But I'd like to show you some pictures of my last trip. So this is at the entrance of the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range. This is a territory that's blocked off. It's barricaded. You can't go through the gates. And if you look on the right-hand side through the trees, you'll see a little bit of silver glistening. This is the pipelines that run right through the Air Force range. So not only is the Air Force range bombed and missiled and torpedoed and strafed and shot at, it is also heavily drilled and fracked. So this is the pipeline. The Cenovus is one of the many oil and gas companies are active in the area. And the Air Force range is 30 minutes away from the city center. And the road, there's one road, and this road is dotted with these black oil tanks. And these are the reserves of the oil, and then tanker trucks come and they get the oil and gas, and they put them on their tanker trucks and they drive out. In the city center, there is a road that leads to the entrance of the Air Force Base. And I put my sign up, no fighter jets, green jobs, not war jobs. I protest every time that I go there. And within about 10 minutes, the military police, make me bring down my signs. You can see that it's not too far away from the gate on the left-hand side. And you can see on the right-hand side that there is a mounted fighter jet there. There's a little bit of a public park there. And then right at the center of the town, at the main intersection, there is another mounted fighter jets. There's more in the city. And I stood with my sign. This was at the time that the federal budget was being announced, with my new sign, cut military spending, fund Indigenous reconciliation. The First Nations community were only given 4 pieces of land. They're disconnected for their reserves, and the First Nations community, many of the members live in poverty, in dilapidated housing. Most of the reserves don't have paved roads. I wanted to go and visit one of the elders on the reserve of English Bay, but I wasn't able to drive my rental car on the roads because they were so muddy, and I was worried that I was going to get stuck, so I couldn't make it through. And so this is how the people are living. We are investing in fighter jets when First Nations community have terrible housing and they don't have potable water. At the time that I was in Cold Lake just earlier this month, this was at a time where they were engaged in night flight training. So about 2 times a year for about 10 days, the fighter jets train not only in the morning, but also at night. So they start at 8:30 in the morning and they finish at about, at least until 11:30 at night. I heard them flying over the hotel. I was staying at the Dene Hotel on one of the reserves. And they are very disruptive. You can hear them very loud at night. While I was up in Cold Lake, I passed out copies of this report that I wrote and released just a few weeks ago. It's called Soaring: The Harms and Risks of Fighter Jets, Why Canada Must Not Buy a New Fleet. And it documents the environmental, social, and financial risks of these fighter jets. And I encourage you to go to the WILP Canada website and get a link and share it with your member of parliament. In that report, there is this graphic, and it speaks to what Brent was talking about, the opportunity cost. We could be either investing in fighter jets, or we could be investing in things that Canadians and Indigenous communities really need: healthcare, education, affordable housing. Last month, the Department of National Defense announced that our fighter jets our current fleet of CF-18s are going to be going back this summer to Romania. And this goes to Yves' point about the threat of escalation. So for the past 8 years, Canadian fighter jets have been on a rotating and regular deployment into Eastern Europe. We've got Canadian fighter jets that fly out of a NATO base in Romania, Poland, and in Lithuania. They engage in these NATO operations and exercises, primarily flying up and down Russia's borders. Over the past 8 years, this has been very dangerous and very provocative, and this has contributed to the tension that we're seeing right now in Ukraine. Now I want to talk quickly about NATO and military spending. It's not only because of our membership in NATO and NORAD that we're buying new fighter jets, but it's because of our membership in NATO that we're increasing military spending. So this is a chart from the latest NATO Defense Expenditure Report, and it shows in 2014, military spending was $20 billion. Last year, the Canadian government estimated that we were going to be spending $33 billion on the military. This is a combination of Department of National Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs. And as you heard in our federal budget, our defense minister is going to increase this by another $8 billion over the next few years. At this level of military spending, Canada is ranked 13th highest in the world. This is according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And this is military spending over the past 60 years. This is World Bank data, and you can see how much it's been increasing. And not only has military expenditures been increasing, but carbon emissions are increasing. And there is a link here. So Department of National Defense, among all federal departments and agencies, accounts for 61% of all federal government emissions. So it's a huge amount. And the Department of National Defense accounts for 30% of all federal departmental spending. So if we're serious about decarbonization, we have to talk about and engage in demilitarization. Now, what is Canada doing, the Canadian military doing with all of this fossil fuel and with all of this public funds? Well, it's not engaged in peacekeeping. We are very much engaged in war making. This is a chart from the latest UN Peacekeeping Office. It shows that Canada is ranked 69th in the world. For peacekeeping, we only have 62 soldiers wearing the UN blue helmet out of a force of 60,000. So it's very low for peacekeeping. So our organizations, the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and WILP Canada, we're calling for Canada out of NATO. We want the alliance to be abolished, and we hope that you will join us in that campaign. We are also participating in a global campaign against military spending that's being led by the International Peace Bureau, and that's on right now. And the theme this year is Give Peace a Budget. You can find out more at the International Peace Bureau. We are also supporting the campaign to stop Lockheed Martin, the manufacturer of these fighter jets, the largest weapons manufacturer in the world. And I encourage you to check out that website. There's a petition that you can sign. And then I also want you to stay tuned to the NATO Counter Summit that the European peace activists are planning for Madrid at the end of June. We are going to be planning a webinar that we hope for Canada that we hope that you'll participate in, because we are going to be launching a campaign, Canada Out of NATO. And then finally, I want to let you know about an event that I am planning for this Saturday. And I would like to show you my other nice new banner. This one says, "Stop the war, Trudeau, Freeland, Anand, and Jolie. Stop lying, stop sending weapons, stop NATO, peace in Ukraine, peace in Russia." And this Saturday at 12 o'clock Eastern, I'm going to be moderating a panel with Dr. Vladimir Kozin. He's a Russian military expert, with Igor Lopatonok, who is the filmmaker for Ukraine on Fire, and also Bruce Gagnon with the U.S. Veterans for Peace, who has been to Ukraine, Russia, and Crimea several times over the past few years. So I will put my I will put my email in the chat, and feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to share my slides and give you more information about the upcoming events and campaigns. Thanks very much. Oh, and I'm hoping that we can show the 1-minute video of me taking pictures of the fighter jets at Cold Lake.
Does our technical producer have that ready?
Yep.
Okay.
This is at the Cold Lake Air Force Base. You can see the fighter jet overhead. It's a beautiful sunny day. This is April 2022. You can hear how loud it is. They fly all day long. They're training. And at this time right now, actually, they're training late until the night, until about midnight. I'm on the CFB Cold Lake Air Force Base, and you can see this strategic fuel tanks there for the fighter jets. This is the Military Family Resource Center. I'm right on the base. And you can hear the fighter jets up in the sky.
Okay, thank you very much, Tamara. Very, very, very informative. Okay, so we'll move on now to Barry Weisletter, who's a writer, organizer, and a former Ontario Public Service Employees Union Executive Board member. He is chair of the NDP Socialist Caucus and a steering committee of the Workers' Action Movement. Barry is co-editor of Socialist Action Publications, Turn Left Magazine, and is the Federal Secretary of Socialist Action. Welcome, Barry.
And there, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Well, good evening, everyone. Tamara, Yves, and Brent have done a terrific job of exposing Ottawa's policy on war spending and NATO. I wish to spark a discussion on political action. While the emphasis should be on mass protest actions in the street, what about the electoral arena? What about the need for an anti-war, anti-capitalist government? Where is the NDP in this picture? On March 22nd, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh found a way to avoid a federal election and to gain a small reform, but it comes at a very high cost. A huge increase in military spending, not to mention big subsidies to carbon and energy corporations. The Liberal NDP confidence and supply deal paves the way for Justin Trudeau to stay in power until 2025. That assures capitalist political stability in the relentless march to climate catastrophe, growing social inequality, and the horrors of inter-imperialist warfare. The deal would see the NDP support the minority government Liberals in upcoming confidence votes, including the next 4 federal budgets, in exchange for a phased-in, non-universal dental care program. Other reforms were promised, but notably in the April 7 Liberal federal budget, no mention of pharmacare, for example. Of the 2 leaders, Justin Trudeau absolutely gained the most. Assuming the pact continues, Trudeau gets to implement his agenda without rolling the dice on every confidence vote in Parliament. That means that billions more for everything from pipelines to fighter jets and Navy frigates can be implemented without the risk of triggering an election. It casts the Prime Minister as conciliator. Jagmeet Singh, on the other hand, has taken on the role of riverboat gambler in this made-for-TV miniseries. In return for supporting a minority government, he hopes to appear to punch far above the weight of the 25 seats he won in 2021. It's a big gamble for Singh. Former NDP leader Thomas Mulcair, who is no radical, told CTV he wouldn't have signed the cooperation agreement with the Liberals. This deal is more co-optation than cooperation for the NDP. The Liberals are the masters of identity theft, usually at the NDP's expense. If the NDP sticks with the Liberals until 2025, its candidates will be faced at the doorstep with a tough question. How can the NDP ask to replace the Liberals after spending 3 years propping them up? The Liberals will enjoy the advantage of NDP endorsement to do whatever they want, like the Emergencies Act that Trudeau invoked in mid-February. This deal says to the working class that it is okay to unite with a boss's party against the workers. Singh has once again demonstrated his naive belief that the difference between the NDP and the Liberals is just a few ideas, that the NDP are just Liberals in a hurry, which may be true for the privileged middle-class leadership of the NDP. But the founding of the NDP in 1961 as a party based on labor unions and the Canadian Labour Congress was a step forward for the working class. It was the creation of an independent political arm for labor, a partial break with big business and Bay Street. There is no such party in the United States. The NDP should be based, however, on Main Street, on the working class, women, impoverished, racialized, and oppressed folks. All the other political parties represent the bosses, the capitalists, the fossil fuel industry, the mine owners, the arms industries, giant telecoms, big pharma, retail chain empires, agribusiness, mega manufacturers, loan sharks, and the banks. The pact with the Liberal Party means Singh will vote for increases in war budgets and war profits. He will back wars in which working class families die or become refugees. NATO and Biden demand a military spending target of 2% of gross domestic product. That would mean increasing military spending by $16 billion in a single year, up from current spending of more than $26 billion this year to meet that target. Singh's commitment to provide the Liberals with confidence and supply implies endorsement for beefing up the Canadian forces, participate in NATO wars, as it did in Afghanistan, the Balkans, and Libya. It involves backing the NATO puppet regime in Kyiv, providing lethal aid to Nazi battalions battering the Donbass population, shipping weapons to the Saudi monarchy, pulverizing Yemen, and boosting the Israeli apartheid state. It means backing any moves by Trudeau to complete the TMX pipeline and to continue underfunding healthcare and ignoring the needs of Indigenous people. Singh and most NDP leaders simply support capitalism, even though the party is based on the organized working class, which is exploited under this system. They are right-wing social democrats who seem incapable of change. They have to go. But we can't get rid of them by ignoring the NDP or by supporting certain Greens or Liberals. Our task is to build the socialist left in the NDP and the unions, to fight for socialist policies and leadership that's clearly on the side of the working class. For socialist action, the NDP is an arena of struggle, not a place to relax. At the same time, We strive to build a mass anti-war movement and a revolutionary workers' party to lead the way to peace, prosperity, and freedom. Do you agree? Thanks. Elizabeth, your mic.
I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm going to go to our technical producer now for our first 3 questions. Put them in the chat. Okay.
Yeah. So our first question is from Dinner with Franklin, and they ask, did Yves say that Jason Kenney was instrumental in the formation of Operation Unifier? The second question comes from Judy Kosh. Why should imperialist powers like the US and Canada be involved in the war? And the third question is, how can workers and poor people make their anti-war views be known?
Okay, so you each have up to 5 minutes to answer the questions, and the lineup will be Brent, Tamara, Barry, and Yves. So Brent, you're on.
Great, thanks. Great questions. And Judy was a neighbor once when I lived in Toronto, so it's good to see that question. I might just, I might just start with how can people let their anti-war views be known? I mean, I think there's lots of ways to do that. In Tamara's slideshow, she was mentioning this week of action that's happening now against Lockheed Martin. I would highly suggest that you check out, I think it's on the World Beyond War website in terms of where locations for these actions are happening across the country and around the world. And if you're near one, go to that. If you're not, maybe you could organize one. We will have one, if you're watching this live, we will have one tomorrow, Friday, April 22nd, both in front of the Lockheed Martin head office in Ottawa and at the Prime Minister's office, also often in Ottawa. Come out to that. Also, there will be a major mobilization in Ottawa at the CanSec Weapons Show that is happening June 1st and 2nd. A weapon show, not incidentally, sponsored by Lockheed Martin, a really important opportunity for people to come out and say no to weapons dealers, to say that we don't want arms dealers here, to speak against war and against militarism. And as I mentioned in my talk, we have until October and the signing of this contract between Canada and Lockheed Martin for these 88 F-35 warplanes. And there's lots of popular mobilization that should be done in that time. And maybe I'll just wrap up here. I'm not sure I am on time, but just relating to what Barry was saying, I mean, the NDP has basically taken the position on the F-35s or on warplanes that the measure is the economic benefits for the country, which is, really, when you think about it, a horrendous way to evaluate or measure the spending on war machines in terms of economic benefits. And so they definitely need to be pushed on that issue. Incidentally, too, or not incidentally, Jagmeet Singh, when asked about Canada purchasing up to $5 billion of armed drones for the military, I think said something like, I don't know, I think it was something like, maybe this isn't the direction we want to go, or a very weak comment, not the kind of strong rejection one would hope in terms of this new arsenal for the Canadian military. Anyways, I'm sure my 5 minutes are up, and I'm keen to hear what others have to say about those questions. So maybe I'll just leave it there for now if I can.
Okay, thank you, Tamara.
So yeah, just a couple of quick things. I put in the chat a link to the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. I would really like to encourage people to get involved that way. We have an email list, a Google Groups, where you can stay in touch with peace activists all across the country, find out about campaigns and events, and share resources and actions and support one another. There's meetings that take place roughly once every 2 months. So this is really an important way to get engaged. There is an anti-war movement in Canada. This is a really important venue for it, and really important way to get involved. I have been meeting with a number of MPs, both Liberals and NDP MPs, several of them over the past few months. Just today, I had a meeting with Waterloo MP, Liberal Bardish Chagger, and I really encourage people to reach out to their MPs and ask for meetings. In February, I met with a number of people, the NDP defense critic, Lindsay Matheson. She's in a London, Ontario riding. Gave her a copy of the report, Soaring, the Harms and Risks of Fighter Jets and Why Canada Shouldn't Buy a New Fleet. And we've passed this out to a number of MPs. They really need to hear from you, because they're hearing from CADC, the weapons lobby here, the Canadian Aerospace and Defense Security Industries. That's the arms lobby in this country. They're hearing from them. They're also hearing from the Ukrainian Canadian community, which is pro-war in Ukraine. And so our MPs really need to hear from us. I also want to mention, I also want to do a plug for one of Yves' latest book, this one, Standing on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. I actually bought an extra copy and I brought it up to the Cold Lake Public Library, and I talked to the librarian there. I had a copy of this book. And I also brought them a copy of this book, Profits of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military Industrial Complex by William Hartung. I really encourage you to get that book, and a copy of my report. So I asked them to put it out in a public display at the public library and make it available to the community. So actually, I would like to encourage you to get a copy of Yves' latest book, Standing on Guard, share it, circulate it, and yeah, it's an important read. Thanks.
Thank you, Tamara. Barry?
Well, I certainly want to echo Tamara's sentiment with regard to Yves' books. Socialist Action is always doing promotion when we can, in person particularly, to assist in the launch of his books on many occasions. So I totally agree. Some really good questions are posed here, so let's try to tackle a couple of them. Why are the imperialist powers involved in the Ukraine war or in wars, wars of aggression around the world? Well, the answers are basically two: resources and geopolitical power. Resources, well, you know that Ukraine is actually was the breadbasket of the world and has a lot of very valuable mineral resources, which the West craves, and if you can tell what would happen to Ukraine if it were unimpeded in joining NATO by looking at what's happened to countries in Eastern Europe since they did join NATO, and that is wages plummet and resources are for the highest bidder obtainable. But it's also a question of geopolitical power. So wars are like a demonstration project. They show those who think about rebelling against the international establishment what's in store. Canada is the country that hosts the biggest mining corporations in the world, and they have interests all over the world, in Southeast Asia, in Central Africa, in Latin America. Let's not forget that it was a Canadian general who headed the NATO bombing of Libya, because Muammar Gaddafi invested too much of the profits from oil and other resources into the population of his own country. I'm not making a case for Muammar Gaddafi, just that he had the highest level of literacy and female participation in the professions and access to education and comparably decent conditions. So it's about resources. It's about geopolitical power. Canada is a junior partner to American imperialism. but it is a partner in the world imperialist system, which transfers enormous wealth, not only in valuable resources, but in cheap labor, which is, which increases the value of resources that are extracted and that benefit corporations in the imperial centers. How can workers make their views known? Well, I would say the following are first and foremost on our list for implementation: mass action in the streets. It's very difficult now because Putin has handed Washington and its allies a juicy, sweet plum. But this too will pass. And it's necessary to build a broad democratic anti-war movement which is prepared to take action. That will condition everything else. I'm not opposed to writing letters to members of parliament. I do it myself occasionally, signing petitions, a sit-in, even a minority action, like Yves does so admirably, disrupting a minister's news conference. All of these things are fine. But decisive is mass action. When you can demonstrate that thousands and tens of thousands of people are prepared to take action. This is how the anti-war movement stopped Canada's participation in the Iraq war. It didn't stop the deployment of warships in the Persian Gulf and all kinds of hostile actions, and 20 years of imperialist intervention in Afghanistan, which ended very ignominiously for Ottawa and its allies. But anti-war action has demonstrated its capacity to end the war in Vietnam, alongside the valiant struggle of the Vietnamese people, first and foremost, and many other unjust wars. Secondly, fight for anti-war policies in unions and the NDP, and not just by moving the resolutions from time to time. And we take pride in the fact that we were able to win the NDP at its federal convention in the 2006 in Quebec City, Canada out of Afghanistan, to such an extent that Jack Layton was momentarily referred to in the mass media as Taliban Jack, an unearned title. But that was the result of work that we and other anti-war activists did in the NDP. We built the Socialist Caucus, which stands for anti-capitalist and anti-war policies. So these achievements don't just fall from the sky. It takes a lot of work, and it's worth doing. The same applies to the unions, where we are advocates of the Workers' Action Movement, which runs anti-capitalist candidates at the CLC level, at the Ontario Federation of Labour, at the last two conventions in the province, as well as in the upcoming CUPE Ontario convention and many others. And most importantly, to build a party that is dedicated to doing all of these things. And Socialist Action is certainly committed to doing that at the level of education, but also at the level of direct political action. Thanks.
Thank you, Barry. Yves?
Yeah, I did say that what I was quoting about Jason Kenney was that Petro Poroshenko, the president from 2014 to 2019 of Ukraine, that he said that Jason Kenney was the godfather of the modern Ukrainian military for his role in establishing Canada's training mission, which I understand was actually the first, before the Americans and the British, that Canada was the instigator, and I think that's fairly significant, right? In recent days, the Wall Street Journal had a front page article a week ago about the NATO training mission, and talked about how important it begins with a thing from a Ukrainian a soldier saying that when he kills or counterattacks Russian troops, he thanks Canadian trainers. And Radio-Canada also published a big, long 2,800 word article that details that they've spent $900 million in training the Ukrainian military over the past 7 years, and it details a whole bunch of the neo-Nazis that Canadian officials were training and knowingly training. So it's a fairly important Canadian contribution. To some extent now they're kind of boasting about it, right? Canadian officials are kind of boasting about it, but the it's partly what precipitated the war, of course, right? This both at the level of avoiding, allowing the Ukrainian state to avoid adopting their commitments under the Minsk protocols or accords that were negotiated with France and Germany and United Nations Security Council endorsed, and also at the level of basically this being part of a process of bringing Ukraine into NATO. In terms of activism, I agree. I mean, I think that mass action is ultimately what we need to, if we're going to have real success in anti-war activism. It's beyond petitions and email campaigns, and it's in the streets, and it's disruptive and all that kind of stuff. So I completely agree on that point. But in tangible, I mean, I invite people to get on the email lists of Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, World Beyond War, other groups, to be aware of what is being currently organized, be it online or in person. In terms of understanding the why question of why Canada has been so aggressive on Ukraine, I mean, I don't think there's a simple explanation. First thing that we need to keep in mind here is that Canada has been in conflict to varying degrees with Russia for a century and a half. Right, in the 1850s, when the Crimean War, all of the British troops in Canada, pre-Confederation, and many volunteers went and fought. Right, during World War I in 1917, there was about 6,000 Canadian troops that were sent to Russia. The idea initially was it was a way to get Russia back into World War I, but there was Canadian troops that landed in Vladivostok 2 months after the end of World War I. In the 20s, Canada tried to isolate Bolshevik Russia. For a period during World War II, there was a de facto alliance, but then after World War II, you go into Cold War. So Russia has been viewed as a geopolitical competitor by the British and American empires. And Canada has been a close ally of the British and American empires. Another part I think that's important to understand is that Canada has been one of the most staunch proponents of NATO since its, before its foundation, right? Some people say it was a Canadian idea, the creation of NATO. It was the US, Britain, and Canada that had the secret negotiations in 1948 to establish NATO. And so it's sensible, it's logical progression from there that Jack Granatstein, a military historian in 2007, he said that 90% of all Canadian military contributions since 1949 was devoted to NATO. Even the peacekeeping mission that Pearson became famous for in 56, what Pearson's main objective was with Egypt in 56 was actually division within NATO between Britain and the US. That was really what he was trying to deal with. That was the crisis, was the division between Britain and the US over, within NATO, not Egyptian civilians or, sovereignty. So Canada has taken NATO incredibly seriously over decades and decades. So their pushing of NATO eastward. I think another part we have to understand, and when we talk about what this conflict in Ukraine is about, it is partly a conflict, or it's a way for Washington and Canada joining it to undermine Germany and France and cooperation within Germany. I mean, it's these discussions about Germany getting gas from like Qatar, or getting natural gas from the US or Canada. I mean, that's economically speaking, completely, ridiculous, versus getting gas from Russia, of course. I mean, that just makes way more sense. So part of what this is about Washington dominating security relations in Europe and having major impact on the economies of Central Europe, France, Germany, etc. And it's bringing it under NATO. They prefer the security relations to be under NATO rather than be under some sort of common European security arrangement. Finally, I think another part we have to kind of think about in all this, and which I think goes to how Canadian foreign policy works, is that, the morality is really not part of what's going on in Canadian foreign policy, and not in other policies either. But it's so far removed that there's so lack of democracy in foreign policy that the decision makers can sort of do whatever they want, and the worst of what they do comes out. But part of why Canada and the U.S. Are able to be so aggressive on Ukraine, Russia, is that it's relatively low cost for Canada compared to some of the European countries, right? Even the sanctions, right? We can bring in sanctioning Russian oil because we're not actually importing Russian oil. And that sort of generalizes. But one of the things I think that's kind of unique with the Ukraine thing is that simultaneously, while they can take these aggressive positions with fairly limited cost to Canada, they have the cover, the public relations cover of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and the organized Canadian community. And there's a whole story there. I don't have time to get into that right now, but they kind of frame it as that this is like, this is what Ukrainian Canadians want. And so that from the Canadian government's public relations standpoint, they can pursue a pro-Washington, pro-NATO, pro-military industrial complex policy on Ukraine, Russia, but frame it as sort of like this, this is what the diaspora Ukrainian Canadian community wants, which is partly true and of course partly not.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to go back now to our producer for the second round of questions. David?
Yep. So our first question comes from Ellen Ramsey. They ask, how can union members mobilize against the war machine? The second question comes from Robert McDermott. Question on the Northwest Passage. Neither Russia nor the US recognize Canadian sovereignty, and both have really bad environmental records. Their only interest is in exploiting the resources in an environmentally sensitive area. How would socialists deal with that issue? And the third question comes from Tom Baker. They ask, how have the warmongers who control the Canadian government duped Canadians into supporting these crimes against humanity?
Okay, so this time, unfortunately, you only have 4 minutes for these 3 questions. And the lineup is Tamara, Barry, Yves, and Brent. Tamara?
Well, so just really quickly, I actually have reached out a number of times to Unifor, and I've had the opportunity to speak to CUPE about the fighter jet issue. Unifor has not gotten back to me. They have resisted a meeting. So if you are involved in a union, I would be really grateful for you reaching out to your union leadership, and I would be happy to participate in a meeting and share the information that I have on the fighter jets, on military spending. It would really be great to get labor on side. We haven't seen labor as active in the peace movement as we have in the past, and we could really use their support both morally and financially. There's very little resources in the peace movement. And so there's a big role that unions could play. So please reach out to me if you can help with that in any way. And then I just want to address a couple of things. There is something called the Arctic Council. All of the Arctic countries are involved in the Arctic Council, to try to, work on social, environmental, some political issues, to deal with, try to work cooperatively in the Arctic. It's a fragile ecosystem. It's the fastest warming region on the planet. We don't want to militarize and industrialize the Arctic. We need to protect it. So there is a forum, the Arctic Council, that we should be encouraging Canada to engage with cooperatively. There's also something called the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Russia is a party to it, Canada is a party to it, the United States has resisted, but it provides a mechanism for dealing, again, peacefully and cooperatively with any kind of conflict in the marine environment. And in fact, Canada and Russia have a dispute over the Lomonosov Ridge, which is in the Arctic, and we have been not using our warships pointing back, at each other. We've been actually, having lawyers work on maps and scientists and trying to resolve the conflict that way. I also want to just mention that another aspect of this Ukraine crisis is that the Russian pipelines, there are two major ones, go through Ukraine and through Belarus. The United States and Canada want to turn off these Russian pipelines, and they also want to block China, because the rail lines and the pipelines not only go through Russia, into Europe through Ukraine and Belarus, but the rail lines from China into Europe go through Russia and Ukraine, and so this war is also with an eye to China, and trying to keep China out of Europe, and yeah, I think. That's all I'll say at that point. Please get involved. There's lots of ways, and thanks for coming out tonight.
Okay. Thank you very much, Barry.
Right. Some more terrific questions. Not enough time. What are we going to do? I'm going to go back to the question of the blue helmets. Would more blue helmets help? I don't think so. I think we need to recall that, Canadian so-called peacekeepers helped Washington overthrow the government of Patrice Lumumba in Congo. He represented a radical threat to the imperial resource extractors. And take a look at the role of Canadian peacekeepers in Cyprus, or for that matter, the Golan Heights. Didn't stop the Zionist apartheid state from encroaching further. Right up to the borders of Syria. I'm going to be provocative, okay? I'm going to say, does Canada actually need a military? Do we need an armed force? And some people might think that this is a question that you can't even ask in polite company. Well, first of all, the Canadian state is not neutral. For any purpose to which the Canadian military is put, it's most likely going to be on the side of capital and against working people. And it's going to make us pay for it and die for the interests of big profit. But do we need, for example, a search and rescue force? Well, Canada's almost surrounded by oceans and extreme weather and more of it to come. So it is useful to have a force that is dedicated to helping people who are in unsafe and threatening conditions. More firefighters. It looks like we're going to have another heat dome on the West Coast and central Canada. So, there's a role. There's a role for young people who want to help ordinary people. Long-term care intervention. The horrendous conditions. Remember 2 years ago, seniors were dying in very large numbers, and it was necessary to actually call in the armed forces to make sure that PPE was employed and that the patients were not, living so close to one another and were being fed and cleaned. And, it took the military. I mean, it's kind of absurd that this is what a military perhaps could do more usefully than what it does. But I would point in that direction. But basically, who does Canada have to fear? Well, what kind of Canada? The present Canada, in which Ottawa's policy is basically, dovetailing on a daily basis with Washington policy, it doesn't have much to fear, except 90% of the world which disagrees with American foreign policy, but they're not so close. But if Canada was socialist or even left social democratic, it would have to fear who? It would have to fear Washington, which habitually overthrows governments that threaten the interests of the corporate elite. So would these fighter jets help? How long would they last in a clash with their American counterparts? A few hours, maybe only a few minutes. So the absurdity of spending billions and billions of dollars on this stuff, which is not really aimed at defending the working class in Canada against its real enemies at home and abroad, is really stark. Let's remember that Ukraine bombed and shelled the Donbass for 8 years. That is what laid the basis for this present conflict. People of the Donbass deserve self-determination. Putin's intervention, his bloody invasion, doesn't secure that. In fact, it adds more states to NATO membership and poses even greater dangers. But Putin is not an anti-war activist. He's an imperialist, just like the government of in Kiev and their allies, who outlaw socialist political parties and defenders of Russian language speakers in the east of Ukraine, and so on. So these are important points to keep in mind when we have to think about what kind of an anti-war movement can we and should we try to build. Our slogans are no war in Ukraine, NATO out of Eastern Europe, Canada out of NATO, no sanctions, no military intervention by Russia, stop US weapons supplies to Kiev, self-determination for the peoples of Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbass.
Thank you, Barry.
How have the warmongers duped Canadians?
No, you're way
The
over
right-wing
time.
media. The right-wing media has done a lot to help in that regard. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to Yves. I'm trying to keep everybody to their time because we have more questions. Go ahead, Yves.
In terms of the duping, I mean, I have a book called The Propaganda System, How Canada's Government, Corporations, Media, and Academia Sell War and Exploitation. And I try to answer some of that question. And there's obviously many facets to understanding how the ideological apparatus, the propaganda system, if you like, works. Yesterday, or the day before, the Canadian press ran a story about an F-35 proponent to pilot. And they ran a long story saying, now all the hiccups that were previously reported about the F-35, they're all gone, and now it's Canada's really got a great deal because we're going to get this plane for a bit cheaper, and it's a better, it's further along in the development process, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think it was David Puglisi, probably the only corporate media journalist that's somewhat critical of the military. And I should point out, this was Lee Bartume from the Canadian Press, who's their military reporter. He pointed out that the person that they're interviewing, this big long story is based upon, is somebody who's been on the pay of Lockheed Martin for years and years, and he was a former employee and all this kind of stuff. And that sort of generalizes, right? If you look at what institutions are quoted in the dominant media about military and foreign affairs, you find that they're usually funded by military companies or the Department of National Defense's mines program. You find that these different many different academic departments, the defense studies, security studies at universities, those were usually set up with funding from the Department of National Defense. There isn't really a counter force on foreign policy issues. Like on domestic issues, the labor movement, the union movement provides somewhat of a counter force, right? They, with all kinds of issues with unions and whatever, but there are, millions of members in the country, over 3 million members, 4 million members, and they all provide dues, and unions have, thousands and thousands of employees that are, working, and they, have some, they have communications employees, and they provide somewhat of like a pushback to the capitalist class domination of the discussion on domestic issues. But on foreign policy, the terrain is really almost entirely in the hands of the military, the arms companies. If you look at university departments, a whole bunch of the Norman Patterson School at Carleton, where it produced a lot of the diplomats, it's got really close connections to Global Affairs Canada. You look at the Munk School of Global Affairs, right? Probably the most important foreign policy university department. Well, that was set up by Peter Munk, who was the owner of Barrick Gold, which had major self-interest in a certain type of pro-mining Canadian foreign policy. Peter Munk was somebody who was a big proponent of Augusto Pinochet, very right-wing kind of policies. And then, of course, you have just the media itself and who owns the media. And so it's real. The ideological apparatus on foreign policy of spinning a sort of pro-corporate, pro-Canadian government line is very powerful. It's obviously also integrated with the American ideological apparatus, which is even more powerful. So the battle is real. It's a big battle. We need to challenge the mythology. I'm a strong believer that we don't need to reinforce the mythology. A lot of people, there's
30 seconds.
Segment of sort of peace-minded progressive Canadians who often reinforce the mythology that Canada used to be a peacekeeping nation and we got to return to those days. That didn't exist. That's not Canadian foreign policy history. That's a myth. I think we need to be straightforward and say that Canadian foreign policy is motivated overwhelmingly by two things: support for empire, historically British, today American, and support for Canadian corporate interests. Most of the rest is just a sort of marketing.
Thanks, Yves. Brent?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the great questions, and I think maybe they've been well answered already. I mean, I could quickly add just in terms of for individuals who are members of unions, maybe kind of basic, but just it's just always important to be emphasizing the importance of internationalism. Wars are largely about corporate profit and about control over resource extraction, and it's offset, but it is about workers killing workers. And I think that kind of ethic, or that we need to be remembering that within unions, also in terms of the billions of dollars that are wasted on weapons, that it's important, I think, to emphasize within unions how the money that is spent on war and weapons, how that can be invested in the social good or for the good of workers in all countries. And then maybe just, I mean, there's some really inspiring stories. There's the Patterson film documentary. I don't know how accessible it is, but it's really a beautiful, inspiring story about union workers in a Rolls-Royce factory in Scotland refusing to work on engines that were being used against the Chilean people. There's, I think, lots of other inspiring stories within the labor movement there. I think we need to remember those stories. We need to retell those stories, show those documentaries, and build those principles and that action within the labor movement. In terms of the North, I would just maybe quickly say that I think it's exceptionally important, to be building intersectional movements, and to understand the fight over the Arctic is around oil and gas and minerals and mining that just is facilitated by and exacerbates climate change. And we need internationalists need to be thinking about how can we build meaningful relationships with Indigenous land defenders, with the environmental movement, with peace activists, and many others to bring that to the fore and to organize effectively against the further militarization of the North. On the question of warmongers, again, I think that's been well answered. I would just say, it is a massive PR machine that we're up against. So in order to be able to facilitate the kind of mass action, the mass mobilizations that we need, it really does need to be built on mass education, as it were, or on really building critical thinking and sharing information. And a discussion like tonight, being able to hear the other speakers, I think, is a really good example of what we need much more of to cut through that. And maybe just lastly, I think and maybe on a hopeful note, as powerful as the PR industry is, I think it's often, it is powerful, it is well resourced, but sometimes it's like a sandcastle. I mean, it's fairly weak to popular resistance and the truth and critical thinking. And so we just need to remember that and to do what we can always. So thanks.
Thank you. So we're going to go now to our last round of questioning. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, so the first question comes from the dual transition. They ask, these are offensive weapons. What do they have to do with defending Canada? Who are we defending Canada from? Our only border is with the US, and oceans separate us from China and Russia. The second question comes from Betty Jane Antanavicius. What does the Rideau Institute do? Ceasefire? And the third question comes from Hans Modlik. What happened to the left-wing Ukrainians? They once were the mainstay of Canada's CP.
Okay, so I'm going to go to Tamara first because of family reasons she has to leave very, very soon. And then we will go to Yves, Brent, and Barry. So Tamara, and you have this time 3 minutes, comrades.
Okay, so very quickly, we have been working very closely with Ukrainian Canadians that are associated with the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, the AUUC, that are opposed to this war in Ukraine. They don't want Canada to be sending weapons. And some of them will be on the call on Saturday. So I just wanted to let you know that, or remind you to come out on Saturday. And then I want to end on a hopeful note. 20 years ago, New Zealand made the decision not to buy a new fleet of fighter jets. The new Labour government under Helen Clark tore up the contract for American American F-18s, and not only that, but also canceled the combat wing of the Air Force and cut up the contract for new warships. And still to this day, New Zealand doesn't have a combat Air Force wing. So, you know, that's very inspiring. And then another hopeful possibility is Costa Rica, that abolished its military in 1949. And it's been a real leader on disarmament, demilitarization, and decarbonization. And Costa Rica says it's because of this history of demilitarization that has paved the way for them to get off of fossil fuels. And at the climate summit in Glasgow last November, I was there. Costa Rica led a new initiative called the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, and Canada is not going to join this alliance because of our fossil fuel industry. But you know, there are ways that we can do this. Barry's message about demilitarization is really so important. So, you know, please talk about that. Please share it. Spread those inspiring examples. Feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to share my slides or more information. And thank you again to Socialist Action for providing this opportunity tonight.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so we're going to move now to Yves. 3 minutes.
Yeah, I think people have to be really clear. Every added dollar that is given to the Canadian military is an added dollar to the US military industrial complex, the US empire, in both levels, both in that the Canadian military is completely oriented towards fighting in US-led wars. Also at the level of most of the companies that get the contracts, most of Canada's arms industry are branch plants of the US military industrial complex. So there's one country that could invade Canada, and that is the country that the Canadian military is completely integrated with. I have joked about before that if the US was to invade Canada, there would almost certainly be Canadian military that would be helping that invasion, right? So to frame frame the F-35 or this stuff as defensive is complete nonsense. This is about enhancing US-led domination of the world. So we need to be absolutely clear about that. Also, I think one thing to look at, kind of interesting element, is like Mexico. Mexico basically has no air force, has basically no fighter jets. I've seen conflicting numbers. Some say maybe they have 6 that are sort of semi-operational. So here you have a country that actually has more economic dependence in terms of trade on the U.S. Right, higher proportion of its GDP is trade with the U.S. and Canada's, and a higher proportion of its exports go to the U.S. than any other place. But it spends way less. I think it's something like $6 billion on its military versus, depends on how you calculate it, but 30 billion or something like that for Canada's military. So these are options, right? There are options out there on the table. Canada has had this unique relationship to the two most powerful empires the last 2 centuries, the U.S. and Britain. That's how to understand Canada's military, not as some sort of defensive arrangement. Finally, just with regards to the left-wing Ukrainians, the federal government in 1940 helped in the establishment of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, or its predecessor, partly to marginalize left-wing Ukrainians. The Canadian government accepted huge numbers of Ukrainian immigrants into Canada after World War II. People like Chrystia Freeland's grandfather, who was a Nazi propagandist. Right? The Canadian government has cultivated anti-Russian, or at that point anti-Soviet, anti-Russian Ukrainian Canadian politics and organization. That is a factor in explaining, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress today, and how aggressive they are, and how partly explain how aggressive Canada is on the policy. And there's some very good reports done by Richard Sanders from the Coalition to Oppose the Arms Trade that goes into that history of Canada's role with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and other Eastern European emigre communities. And thanks to Socialist Action for organizing this.
Thank you. Brent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I might just add in question of progressive Ukrainians, always the challenge is connecting with any community or any, set of people, but I mean, they are certainly present there. I'm sort of thinking of just the Waging Nonviolence website that talks about Ukrainian war resistors. I think the question is probably about people in Canada, but broadly speaking, I think it's just important to remember in terms of the worldwide resonance of the no to NATO, no to Putin kind of message, that there are people in Ukraine that carry that message, just as some 15,000 people in Russia have been arrested for opposing the war. I mean, these things cross borders and so on. Ceasefire Rito Institute, quickly, I don't know, actually, to be honest. I imagine check their website, but I don't know how active they are these days. And then lastly, just on the question of offensive weapons, the F-35 is an offensive weapon. Its stealth technology makes it an offensive weapon. It is capable of, it has a first strike capability. I think that's very important in the discussions and debates. And again, I think it's probably been answered in terms of perceived threats to this country. I might just sort of only add, and it might sound a bit different, but just there was a really important report, I think, that was released by the Transnational Institute not so long ago that talked about not so much about kind of militaries, but about the militarization of the Canadian border. And sort of the perception, or I guess the state's perception of where it's putting its money. And so it's something like 10 times the amount is spent on militarizing Canada's borders versus the money spent on addressing climate change and addressing the situation so that people aren't forcibly displaced from their homes because of climate chaos and become migrants because of that, or climate refugees because of that. So it's just another aspect of the militarization issue. So thank you, and thank you to Socialist Action for this discussion.
Thank you, Brent. Barry?
Okay. what is the nature of the March 22nd Liberal budget, the Trudeau-Freeland budget? I submit it's a war budget. I submit that it's a big oil and gas budget. It's an anti-climate, anti-environment budget, including the nonsense about carbon capture by putting it into cement blocks. These are powerful reasons why the NDP should be challenged to break with the Liberal minority government. And for the nervous Nellies out there who are afraid, oh, we'll have an election and the NDP will lose most of its seats. Well, you know, those features of the budget will be supported by the Conservative Party, by the Bloc, and should have no trouble passing. But with the NDP as a backstop, the government will accelerate its commitment to big oil and gas and to war spending. So that's something that we can and should do, is fight to break the NDP from the Liberal minority government. How can union members mobilize? Well, here's an example. It's kind of indirect, but the Ontario Public Service Employees Union just had a landmark presidential election, and JP Hornick won as the new president of the union. And her first act is to mobilize members in the largest region of OPSU, Region 5 Toronto, to come out on May Day, International Workers' Day, on Sunday, May the 1st. That's an example of what roll up your sleeves and do the tough work in the unions to push the unions to the left, as well as the labor-based political party, to which many of them are linked, can result in. And so that's how union members can mobilize, by fighting in the grassroots of the unions for anti-war policies and for a change of leadership, which is also against, class collaborationist policies at the bargaining table and everywhere else. The Northwest Passage, how to protect it as it becomes more and more vulnerable to environmental chaos. Fight for Indigenous self-determination. That fight can be waged at all levels of society, in the streets, in the organizations of the working class. That's not to say that all Indigenous people are going to advocate the same policy and they're going to be against resource extraction. No. In fact, even in Wet'suwet'en territory, where we have a member, we know that there's a conflict on the ground between different factions, some of whom are desperate for employment. But their approach is radically different, even in the exploitation of resources, radically different than the approach of the Canadian oil and gas corporations and the Canadian state. So self-determination for Indigenous people is very, very critical. Left-wing Ukrainians and the Communist Party of Canada. What happened? Well, the Communist Party was hit from two sides. It was hit from the right wing by anti-communist propaganda, and Stalinism did a lot to live up to the worst features of the anti-communist propaganda. But it was also hit from the other side. The Communist Party was a proponent of an alliance with the Liberals, or small L Liberals, if not capital L Liberals, advocating a kind of popular front politics as opposed to united front politics based on the working class and based on an agenda that challenges corporate domination and capitalist rule. So the CP is, for that reason, not just because of the Ukrainian community conservatizing, but because of its self-isolation by anti-worker policies. So what we can do is advocate the United Front. And this really brings me back to a theme that I've stressed at different times in this conversation. United Front means march separately, but strike together. We don't have to agree on everything, but we can agree on defeating the government's pro-war policies, opposing the budget, opposing the war in Ukraine, and opposing particularly our ruling class and its malfeasance in terms of expansion eastward to Russia's borders and heightening the situation. We need to negotiate, not escalate, and we need an anti-war movement that is dedicated to doing that, and we need to build a revolutionary working class political party which is committed to an anti-war, anti-capitalist perspective. And if you agree, my friends, please join us. Together we can make it happen sooner than later. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, comrades and friends, I hope that tonight's webcast inspires you to join Socialist Action. Join us in the quest for a world that is healthier, safer, more sustainable, and therefore one that puts people before profits. Just sign up at our website, www.socialistaction.ca, or give us a call at 647-986-1917. Easy to remember. 1917 was the year of the Russian Revolution. In conclusion, I would like to thank Tamara, Yves, Brent, and of course, Dave Enning, who is our technical producer in Toronto, and Barry Weisleiter, who is also the political producer of SA Webcasts. Please consider being a supporter of Socialist Action newspaper, which we will send to you online. To fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. And once again, if you like the show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next SA webcast will be on Thursday, April the 28th. Celebrate International Workers' Day. It is the 36th annual Socialist Action Evening of speakers, music, and poetry to honor May Day. The webcast will be held on April the 28th, which is Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, because on Sunday, May Day, we will be in the streets. For the first time in 3 years, there will be an in-person rally and march in Toronto, of which I'm coming back to Jamaica just to co-chair the rally. No, kidding, I'll be back home. It's time to come home. And there will be marches in other cities across the country. Details will be announced soon. So everyone, please stay safe, stay healthy, stay active. See you all soon.